Somewhere between rising food prices and forgotten traditions, we lost the humble magic that once fed America. Cheap Amish meals made with heart, not hype. What if the recipes that once held families together are the very ones we've unknowingly erased from our tables? You would not think a meatloaf could carry so much weight, but this one did. Poor man's steak was more than a frugal dish. It was a declaration of survival, a subtle act of rebellion against hard times. Amish families knew how to stretch a dollar, and this hearty alternative to real steak was living proof. Ground beef, flattened into thick, squared patties, breaded with crushed saltine crackers and fried until the edges curled like an old quilt, then simmered in a pan gravy so rich it nearly lied. It was filling, it was warm, and it could fool a hungry stomach into thinking it had eaten something grand. People poured it over mashed potatoes, spooned it next to corn, or just ate it on its own when nothing else was left. In an age when dinner had to be both cheap and comforting, this dish managed to be both. The name may sound humble, but this was luxury wrapped in a lie, told to children so they would sleep full and smiling. Today, we see recipes like this and forget the story behind them. But every crackle of a fried crust reminds you, it was never about steak. It was about getting by with grace. Most people have heard of shoofly pie, but few remember its fluffier, quieter sibling, the shoofly cake. This was the kind of dessert you found on a counter at your grandmother's house, covered with a faded linen towel and dusted with molasses crumbs. Unlike the sticky pie, shoofly cake was lighter, baked in a sheet pan and sliced into neat brown squares that stuck to your fingers in all the best ways. It was made for Sundays, for unexpected guests, for potlucks and funerals, and sometimes just because someone was craving something sweet in the middle of a week that had gone sour. Amish kitchens had their rhythm, and shoofly cake was one of those steady beats. The magic was in its use of basic staples: molasses, flour, baking soda, and hot water. No frosting, no fruit, no filling. Just a dense, caramel-flavored bite that told you sugar was a gift and not a guarantee. It came from frugality, from scraping the barrel and still baking something worth remembering. Breakfasts were different back then. You did not scroll a phone or sip a $6 latte. You stood over the stove flipping slabs of fried cornmeal mush until the kitchen smelled like waking up on the right side of the world. Amish homes made this by instinct. Cold, leftover mush from yesterday's pot, cut into thick rectangles, pan-fried in lard or butter until golden and crispy on the outside, creamy on the inside. It came alive with maple syrup or sometimes sorghum if that was all you had. This was the food of farmers, of children with frost in their hair and dirt on their shoes, of women in aprons who measured nothing but got it right anyway. The mush started as a simple boiling of cornmeal and buttermilk, whisked until it thickened and poured into pans to cool overnight. The next morning, you sliced it like bread and gave it a second life. And that is what it was, really. A second life for leftovers, a second life for mornings that felt like they would never end. In a world that forgets what it means to make do, this dish still whispers a lesson. You do not need much to make something good. You just need to care. They looked like ornaments for a table that had seen too much winter. The eggs, stained deep purple from soaking in beet brine, were stacked in glass jars on every Amish farmhouse shelf. This was not just a recipe, it was a ritual. First, boil the eggs. Then peel them and submerge them in a pickling liquid made from vinegar, sugar, cloves, and the juice from home-canned red beets. Over the next few days, the eggs soaked up the color until they glowed like lanterns. They were sweet, tangy, earthy, and electric, a jolt of flavor when food otherwise tasted like ration books and old shoes. You saw them at barn weddings, funerals, and church picnics. No one ever asked for them. They just showed up, quietly certain of their place. Amish cooks understood the art of preservation, but this went beyond that. It was a way to give something plain, something overlooked, a new identity. It told you that color mattered, that even humble eggs could be transformed into something almost divine. You think you know apple pie. You think of flaky crusts, cinnamon steam, and golden slices melting on your tongue. But this pie came from a different world, It started with dried apples, shriveled and leathery, boiled back to life in a pot of water like something rising from the past. There was no butter-laced filling, no luxury in the crust, just shortening, flour, and cold water. Sometimes brown sugar was added if you were lucky, but even that was a stretch. The result was a pie that tasted faintly of sweetness, faintly of spice, but mostly of memory. Amish families had no room for waste. When apples ripened, they were sliced thin and strung up to dry on thread across kitchens and porches. Months later, those slices were rehydrated, spiced, and baked into pies that reminded people what abundance used to taste like. This pie did not flake or sparkle. It did not melt in your mouth. But it filled your belly and gave you the sense that, just maybe, things would be all right. There is nothing appetizing about the word sour, especially when it comes to breakfast. But back then, when milk went past its prime, you did not pour it down the drain. You made pancakes, thick, golden, soft in the middle, with edges that crisped like lace in a hot cast-iron skillet. These were not just pancakes, these were proof that waste was a luxury no one could afford. Amish cooks knew sour milk still had value. It brought tang, lift, and tenderness to whatever it touched. Mixed with flour, eggs, and baking soda, it transformed a nearly spoiled liquid into something warm and good. You could smell them across the yard, especially when maple syrup hit the hot griddle. They were often eaten plain or with butter scraped from a homemade churn. But even dry, they did the job, and the job was simple. Keep the family fed, stretch what you had, and find joy in what was nearly thrown away. It takes a kind of quiet brilliance to make something beautiful out of something spoiled. There is something about the smell of butter browning in a pan that makes the whole house feel like a prayer. This was not a flashy dish. No sauce, no cheese, no garnish. Just egg noodles, boiled and tossed with browned butter and a pinch of salt. It was what you made when you had nothing, but you wanted dinner to still feel like something. Amish mothers would stir the butter over low heat until it turned golden and nutty, the scent rising like Sunday hymns. The noodles were always homemade, rolled thin on worn counters and cut with care. This dish was usually served as a side, but sometimes, when the pantry was bare, it stood proudly on its own. You would sit down, fork in hand, and suddenly the world was quiet. Warmth, salt, a bite of softness in the middle of a hard week. This recipe was not about impressing anyone. It was about reminding people they were still cared for. You would swear it was pecan pie. You would swear you tasted toasted nuts, caramel, and richness. But there were no pecans, just oats. Rolled oats soaked in a syrupy mixture of eggs, sugar, and a splash of vanilla, baked until the top set and the middle jiggled just enough. This was the pie you made when you could not afford pecans, but still wanted to feel like you could. The Amish were masters of illusion in the kitchen, not to deceive, but to protect dignity, to protect joy, to protect the simple act of dessert after a hard day's labor. The oats mimicked the crunch, the sugar mimicked the depth, and the crust, barely patched together with lard and flour, held it all with quiet grace. You might find a version of this pie in a church cookbook or scribbled on a yellowing index card in someone's attic. It is not flashy, but it is brilliant. A reminder that taste is not about expense. It is about intention. And sometimes, what you remember is not the pecans. It is the feeling that someone cared enough to make pie, even when they had nothing. Mincemeat pies were once the jewel of a table. But when meat ran out, when fruit spoiled, and when sugar was hard to come by, people turned to what was still left in the garden: green tomatoes. Tart, firm, and stubbornly unripe, these were peeled, chopped, and cooked down with vinegar, cinnamon, and raisins if you had them. The result was a pie filling that tasted oddly familiar but haunting in its own way. It did not pretend to be meat. It just reminded you that flavor could come from the most unexpected places. Amish cooks passed this one down quietly, almost protectively, like a secret too strange to share with the outside world. The mixture was sticky, dark, and spiced, preserved in jars and spooned into pies that looked like any other from the outside. And that was the point: to look normal, to feel normal. In a world where nothing was, these pies were a trick of the heart. You could feed a whole family on green tomatoes and no one would feel cheated. It sounds like a joke. It sounds like a mistake. But water pie was neither. It was a marvel. A Depression-era dessert that required no milk, no butter, no eggs, just water, sugar, flour, and maybe a dab of vanilla or a spoon of butter if you had it. The filling came together as a pale, trembling custard. Sweet, subtle, and almost unreal. Amish women made this when the pantry was empty and the world was colder than it should be. You poured water into a pie crust, stirred in flour and sugar, and baked it until magic happened. It firmed up into something between pudding and pie, something you could slice, serve, and call dessert. There was no texture like it. There still is not. You could not taste luxury in it, but you could taste defiance. This pie said, "I will make sweetness out of nothing." We have lost the art of resourceful comfort, but water pie remembers. Schnitz and Knepp was not a dish you stumbled into. It was a dish passed down in quiet voices and heavy iron pots. Dried apple slices, known as schnitz, simmered with chunks of smoked ham in a sweet, salty bath that filled every room with the scent of a time before shortcuts. Then came the Knepp, doughy dumplings that puffed and floated, tender and absorbing. It was a collision of pantry and pasture, preserved fruit and salted meat, tied together with soft flour clouds that tasted like your grandmother's hands. This was not just dinner. This was a moment, a slow-cooked reward after a week of hard labor, a gathering meal meant to stretch, to soothe, to hold. Amish families knew how to work with time. They let the apples soak, let the ham infuse, and dropped the dumplings in only when everything was ready. There was no rush. There was only rhythm. It came out in one pot, served with ladles and silence, and by the end, there was nothing left but the memory of warmth. You hear pot pie and think of golden crusts, bubbling fillings, maybe a touch of rosemary. But in Lancaster kitchens, the real Amish pot pie had no crust at all. Just thick, square-cut noodles known as slip dough, swimming in a brothy stew made from ham hocks, potatoes, and onion. It was a dish born from need and perfected by repetition. Slip dough was not store-bought. It was rolled on flour-dusted tables and cut into squares by hands that knew their way around survival. The broth came from the last shank of ham in the cellar, stretched with water and thickened only by time and starch. It was not pretty, but it was filling. And that mattered more than looks ever could. This pot pie was Sunday supper and Tuesday leftovers. It was ladled into chipped bowls and eaten slowly, because you did not rush comfort. And when the broth hit your tongue, thickened slightly by the noodles melting into it, you remembered what it meant to be full, not just in body, but in spirit. It sounds strange today. Milk soup, cold, sweet, topped with bread crusts and a dash of cinnamon. But for Amish families, this was the taste of a hot summer afternoon, when the oven stayed off and the pantry stayed shut. You would take the morning's leftover milk, stir in a bit of sugar, and pour it over torn bread ends. Nothing wasted, everything used. It was not served in bowls. It was ladled from crockery that had seen decades of wear, poured over stale slices that softened in the milk like old memories resurfacing. The cinnamon was the finishing touch, spicy, sweet, and surprising. Cold milk soup was what you ate when life felt slow, when the heat wrapped around you like a second skin, and you needed something simple to remind you of peace. Children would sip it with wide eyes, uncertain at first, and then nod in quiet approval. There were no rules, no measurements, just instinct. You made do, and in doing so, you made something new. This was the underdog of Amish desserts, the cousin of shoofly pie, but with a creamier, gentler soul. Shoe-in cornmeal pie did not boast or beg for attention. It was humble, pale, and a little odd-looking. But one bite, and everything made sense. The filling was a silky custard made from cornmeal, eggs, milk, and a drizzle of molasses. No crumbs, no crust theatrics, just a smooth, dense layer that baked low and slow until it barely trembled. Amish cooks loved it because it used what was always on hand: milk that needed using, a scoop of cornmeal from the bin, maybe an egg or two. It was a pie that did not apologize. It just existed, gently, like a whisper after grace. This was dessert for families who did not expect frosting. It was served in wedges that sagged on the plate and left behind a trace of warmth on the tongue. The kind of recipe that never made headlines, but stayed folded in the back of recipe boxes for decades. A pie you made when you needed comfort, not compliments. Macaroni salad has become a mayonnaise-drenched cliché at modern gatherings. But the Amish version? It was different. It was better. This was macaroni custard salad, a tangy, creamy miracle that walked the line between savory and sweet without ever stumbling. Elbow macaroni cooked just past al dente, folded into a custard made from eggs, vinegar, sugar, and a touch of dry mustard. It sounds odd until you taste it. Then it makes perfect sense. The eggs turn the dressing into a rich, silky coating. The vinegar cut through the sweetness just enough to make your mouth water. And the macaroni? It held onto every drop like it knew how rare flavor used to be. This salad was not a side. It was a main event. Served cold, sometimes studded with pickles or celery, it landed on every church table and picnic bench with quiet pride. It came from a world where food had to last, where dishes were made with intention and passed around in chipped glass bowls. You can smell it before you see it. Hot lard bubbling, dough crisping, cinnamon rising like smoke from a church kitchen. Breadsticks, twisted and fried, pulled from the oil with long-handled forks and dusted in sugar while still steaming. These were not breadsticks like the kind in restaurants. These were Amish breadsticks. Thick, chewy, golden, fried in pure lard because butter was too precious and oil too scarce. They hit your teeth with a soft crunch and gave way to warm, chewy centers. And the dip? Apple butter. Dark, slow-cooked, spiced with cloves and love, spread thick in a jar that had been sealed during last autumn's harvest. You dipped and bit, until all that was left was the heat in your belly and the sugar on your fingers. These were made during harvest feasts, during county fairs, and sometimes on cold evenings when the power flickered and nothing else could comfort. It was joy built from basics: dough, fat, fruit, and time. The kind of snack you made in silence, shared without ceremony, and remembered for years after. Spring did not announce itself with flowers. It arrived with dandelion greens, plucked from yards before the sun got too high, rinsed 3 times, and simmered into gravy that turned the air green with memory. Amish families knew the first edible sign of the season was not found at a store. It grew wild and unwanted, but never unneeded. The greens were bitter, yes, but boiled and sautéed with flour, lard, and a splash of vinegar, they transformed into something tender and tangy. The gravy clung to potatoes, boiled with skin still on, and turned the plate into a celebration. This was not food from luxury. This was food from hope. You knew winter was over when the dandelions came back. And in that moment, nothing tasted better. Children did not always love the bitterness, but they learned to. Because it meant full bellies, it meant spring, it meant something was growing again. No waste, no pretense, just weeds turned into welcome. Forget the stuff in plastic wrap. Amish bologna loaf was a homemade wonder, dense, spiced, and shaped with purpose. It started with ground meat, usually pork or beef scraps, mixed with mustard, garlic, coriander, and whatever else the seller still offered. Then it was packed into a tin loaf pan, slow-baked until the edges browned and the aroma filled the house like a promise. Sliced thick or thin, served hot or cold, it was school lunch, Sunday dinner, and midnight snack all in one. Unlike store-bought versions, this loaf had depth, texture, soul, the kind you only get from mixing something with your own hands. It was frugal, yes, but never poor. It was a statement. You did not need a butcher to eat well. You just needed a recipe and some resolve. Sometimes it was glazed with molasses. Other times it was wrapped in cloth and smoked in a homemade smokehouse behind the barn. It was not crunchy like coleslaw from a plastic tub. It was better, softer, tangier, made from finely shredded cabbage, carrots if you had them, and a vinegar-based dressing that hit you with bite and then backed off with sweetness. The secret was the celery seed, just enough to tickle your nose and remind you that flavor does not need volume, just clarity. This slaw sat in glass bowls at every gathering that mattered. Weddings, barn raisings, Sunday suppers where 3 generations shared a table. The cabbage was often from the garden, pulled and chopped the same day. The dressing was made on the stove. Sugar, vinegar, mustard, oil, then poured hot over the vegetables so they softened just right. It was not crisp. It was tender, familiar, like eating something your great-grandmother once knew by heart. And every forkful reminded you that old-fashioned did not mean outdated. It meant tested, trusted, true. In a world of thick mayonnaise and shortcuts, this slaw is a revelation, a revival. And once you taste it, you will not crave anything else. This was what you made when the cupboard looked empty, but your stomach would not let you quit. Cornbread mush, boiled cornmeal poured into pans and chilled until it held its shape. The next morning, it was sliced into bricks, fried until the edges crackled, and served hot with molasses butter melting down the sides like candle wax on a hymn book. The mush itself was plain, honest. No spices, no leavening, just meal and water. But the butter, oh the butter, was where the soul lived. Molasses stirred into it turned it dark and shining, rich with the taste of long-forgotten mornings. You ate this slowly, carefully. Not because it was fancy, but because it felt like something sacred. A recipe that had seen too many winters and still held strong. The Amish knew the power of a good starch, and cornmeal, hearty and abundant, was the hero in too many kitchens to count. You did not need fresh fruit to make something special, just dried apple schnitz, some stale bread, and the kind of slow heat only an old oven could offer. This bread pudding was the warm middle ground between breakfast and dessert. Amish families dried their apple slices in the fall, stringing them up like laundry, knowing full well they would need sweetness in January. When the cold months stretched too long, this was what they made. Bread torn by hand, not sliced. Eggs beaten in bowls worn smooth with use. Milk warmed and poured over it all. And the schnitz? They softened in the oven, plumping back to life in a bath of cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar. The result was heavy and tender, speckled with chewy bites of apple, served in squares that collapsed softly under a spoon. This was not something you rushed. It was something you lingered over. You could taste the care. And when topped with a splash of cream or a drizzle of syrup, it was enough to make even the hardest day feel manageable. It was not cheese in the way most people know cheese. There was no rind, no aging cave, no sharpness. Egg cheese, called schmierkäse, was smooth, soft, and spreadable. A cross between custard and curd, made with eggs, milk, and a pinch of salt, cooked low and stirred slow until it thickened into something that defied expectation. It was often made for Easter, a holiday of resurrection and simplicity. But in Amish homes, it showed up throughout the year, especially when milk was plenty and eggs came in faster than they could be eaten. Poured into a cheesecloth and hung to drain, it firmed up overnight, turning into a pale yellow dome of mild comfort. It went best on fresh bread, slathered on thick with a knife passed down from someone's great aunt. Sometimes it was served sweet, with sugar and cinnamon, or savory, with herbs and butter. Either way, it reminded you that food could be quiet and still feel rich. There is a kind of genius in turning almost nothing into something filling. String bean pot pie was a meatless wonder. Green beans, potatoes, and wide egg noodles in a thick broth that clung to every bite like it had something to prove. And maybe it did. It proved that you did not need meat to make a meal. You just needed skill. The beans were usually fresh from the garden or canned from last summer's bounty. The potatoes were whatever had lasted through the root cellar chill. And the noodles, oh, the noodles, were slip dough, cut wide and thick, made to soak up every drop of flavor from the simmering pot. Amish cooks knew how to build a dish around comfort. This was ladled out in wide bowls at long tables, eaten with big spoons and bigger appetites. It was warm, software, and always enough. No one walked away hungry. That was the point. In a world that worships protein, string bean pot pie stands as quiet rebellion, a memory of when food was about feeding, not flexing. You do not see tomato gravy much anymore, but it once ruled breakfast tables with a red-stained spoon and a thick country accent. This was not pasta sauce. This was tomato cooked down with flour, butter, and milk until it turned into a savory, tangy blanket meant to smother biscuits. And not those tall, fluffy restaurant biscuits either. These were dense, hand-cut rounds baked until golden and kissed with lard. The gravy was made from canned tomatoes or leftover stewed ones, thickened on the stove with whatever flour you had, and seasoned just enough to make your tongue remember why tomatoes were kings of the garden. It was often poured over split biscuits and eaten hot with a fork, though some folks sopped it up with torn bread and nothing else. It was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner. It was cheap, it was filling, and it left you warm in places that had no business being cold. Amish cooks understood what made food work. Sometimes the lie is better than the truth. Mock chicken legs, often called city chicken, were not chicken at all. Just cubes of pork or veal skewered on wooden sticks, breaded and fried or baked until golden. It was a dish built on illusion, born in cities where chicken was more expensive than pork. But Amish kitchens made it their own. The meat was seasoned and stacked on skewers, rolled in flour, then dipped in egg and breadcrumbs. It was browned in hot fat and sometimes simmered low in broth until the coating crisped and the inside turned tender. It looked like a drumstick. It felt like one. And if you had never known the difference, you would swear it was chicken. That was the point. To make something simple feel special. To make a family believe, even just for a meal, that they were eating well. Children loved it. Adults respected it. It was not fancy, but it was clever. Rivel soup was a dish that came from nothing and gave everything. A simple chicken broth, sometimes with potatoes or onion, thickened by rivels. Tiny bits of dough dropped in like whispers. The dough was just flour and egg, pinched together until it crumbled into little lumps. These were stirred into the bubbling pot, puffing slightly, turning the broth from thin to nourishing. This was soup for lean days, soup for sickness. Soup for evenings when the fire was low and so was the mood. There was no cream, no cheese, no garnish, just depth, flavor from bones boiled all day, texture from dough made by feel. It was ladled out slowly, carefully into bowls held close to cold hands. And as you ate, you felt better. Not because it was rich, but because it was real. The Amish never wasted flour. They never wasted anything. And Rivel soup was their way of saying, "We will get through this." This was the cake that sat on the windowsill, cooling while the house filled with voices and footsteps. Crumb cake, soft and spiced, topped with a thick layer of sweet crumbs that crunched when you bit in. The base was simple: flour, eggs, sugar, cinnamon, but the secret was the topping. Brown sugar and flour cut with butter and scattered generously until the cake wore a second skin. And then came the frosting. Buttermilk whipped with powdered sugar and a touch of vanilla, tangy, smooth, perfect. The cake was sliced into squares and served with coffee, usually after church or on slow Sunday afternoons. It was not meant to impress. It was meant to welcome, to comfort, to fill in the quiet between conversations. The Amish did not believe in waste, and this cake used what was on hand: buttermilk from the churn, sugar that had lasted just long enough, a spoonful of spice to make everything feel just a bit more like celebration. Fall meant harvest, and harvest meant sorghum popcorn balls, sticky, sweet, and held together by hands that had worked hard all day. Popcorn was cheap, sorghum was plentiful. Together, they made one of the most beloved treats of the season. Amish families popped corn on the stove, catching each burst in wide bowls, then stirred sorghum syrup into a bubbling pot with butter until it turned dark and glossy. The mixture was poured over the popcorn, and then came the real work, pressing it into balls before it cooled. You needed quick hands and a strong grip, But once formed, they were perfect. Wrapped in wax paper, stashed in baskets, handed to children with cheeks pink from cold air. These were the treats that filled corn mazes and schoolhouses, passed out after barn dances and hay rides. They were sweet, yes, but they also held something more. They held the season. They held the effort. They held the understanding that good food did not come from boxes, but from labor and love. It was not quite breakfast, not quite dessert. This custard was its own category, made with cornmeal, brewed coffee, milk, eggs, and just enough sugar to make you wonder if you were being spoiled. The coffee deepened the flavor, the cornmeal gave it texture, and the eggs bound it into a soft, spoonable custard that felt like a hug in a bowl. Amish cooks served this warm, often in the early morning when the farm chores were just beginning, or right before bed, when the lanterns flickered low. It was simple, humble, comforting, made in baking dishes that had seen more seasons than the people holding them. You would not find this recipe in a restaurant. It was too quiet for that. But in the right kitchen, at the right time, it was everything. The first bite was strange. The second was familiar. By the third, you were hooked. It tasted like grit and grace, like work rewarded with something soft and sweet. The kind of dish that does not beg for attention, but earns your respect, one slow spoonful at a time. When every crust mattered, when every heel of bread was saved in a tin on top of the icebox, this is what you made. Bread crust pudding, dry pieces soaked in milk, eggs, and sugar, then baked into something new, something golden, something alive again. It was not pretty, but it was honest. And poured over the top was vinegar sauce, sharp, sweet, and unexpected. Made from water, sugar, butter, and a splash of vinegar that punched through the sweetness like a wake-up call. The sauce sizzled when it hit the hot pudding, seeping into every crack and turning plain crumbs into something transcendent. This was the kind of dessert that got passed over in cookbooks but remembered in families. Amish kitchens never forgot what food was really for. Not display, not trends, just nourishment, made beautiful by intention. Baked oatmeal, a staple in Amish kitchens, transforms a humble pantry ingredient into a dish that's as cozy as it is satisfying. Its origins lie in the Amish knack for turning basic staples into hearty meals, especially for large families or early risers heading out to work. The base ingredients couldn't be simpler: rolled oats, milk, eggs, brown sugar, and butter, with a pinch of cinnamon for warmth. Once mixed and baked, the result is a golden, cake-like texture that's worlds apart from your average stovetop oatmeal. Best of all, it reheats beautifully, making it ideal for busy mornings or meal prepping. Customization is where baked oatmeal truly shines. Add apples and raisins in the fall, fresh berries in the summer, or even chocolate chips for a touch of indulgence. Leftovers can be sliced and eaten cold, or warmed up with a splash of milk. Health-wise, baked oatmeal delivers. Packed with fiber, protein, and slow-burning carbs, it keeps you full for hours. Frugality is its charm, using ingredients most kitchens already have. It's breakfast with all the benefits of comfort food. No shortcuts, just wholesome simplicity baked to perfection. Goose grease was something that people called poor man's butter, but before Crisco could save the day or margarine became a staple name on everyone's tongue tips, goose grease, like beef tallow, was a common sight in most Amish kitchens and rural kitchens. It was used exactly the way you would use butter or lard. You'd use it to fry, to roast, or just to spread on toast, and make it a bit more exciting and interesting than it would otherwise be. Plus, you get grease anyway. It's like when you take a car apart and you get nuts, bolts. Okay? This analogy isn't going anywhere, but you know what did go somewhere? Goose grease. It wasn't just something people used as a cheap substitute for butter, it was also something they used a traditional folk remedy. They would rub it on the chest whenever people had congestion issues, just the way people use Vicks balm today. Amish grandmothers would die on hills swearing how this works better than any of the fancy manufactured crap you can buy in stores, and maybe they really were onto something. Either way, I'll make sure to verify the next time I have some goose grease handy on me. Dried dandelion greens were one of the most readily available sources of vitamins in Amish communities, especially rural ones. People wouldn't really rely on buying store-bought greens. Instead, Amish families had long-held cultural practices surrounding foraging. They would forage for dandelions mostly in spring and summer, and I don't know about you, but that's some real cottagecore stuff to me. Why don't my friends ever message me for a Wednesday 9 a.m. berry and dandelion picking plan? If you're the friend in the group considering this, at least shoot a text so I can live vicariously through you. Oh, but it'll be worth your while too. Dandelion greens aren't just good to the taste, but they feel a lot like spinach too. They're also extremely good for your skin, mixed with other wild greens that make an incredible salad. They work as a detox if you can mix them into a tonic, and Amish communities would essentially ground them into this coffee-like beverage that would help a lot with stomach issues. In Amish kitchens, leftovers are never wasted. They're opportunities. Potato cakes are a perfect example of this philosophy. These golden, crispy patties evolved as a way to breathe new life into yesterday's mashed potatoes. Historically, dishes like this reflected the Amish commitment to resourcefulness, ensuring that every bit of food served a purpose. The ingredients are straightforward and likely already in your pantry. Cold mashed potatoes, an egg for binding, a bit of flour, and a touch of salt and pepper. Some variations include grated onions, cheese, or herbs for extra flavor. The mixture is formed into small patties, pan-fried until crisp on the outside and tender within. It's a simple process, but the result is nothing short of magical. The versatility of potato cakes is unmatched. They can be served for breakfast alongside eggs, as a snack with a dollop of sour cream, or as a side dish at dinner. If you're feeling adventurous, try adding chopped ham or veggies to the mix. Nutritionally, these cakes deliver a good dose of energy from the potatoes and protein from the egg. From a frugality standpoint, they're a dream, stretching leftovers into something exciting and delicious. You know how I keep mentioning that people back then had a real deep-seated mentality of not letting a singular thing go to waste? Well, scrapple was something that was made by German settlers and Pennsylvania Dutch families. It was something they relied on so that every possible part of the pig would be used up and consumed, because that was just free nutrition you were leaving up on the table. Hey, nothing was excluded. Sure, you might be going for some unfamiliar names like the liver, the heart, the head meat, scraps, etc., but people wouldn't even leave the eyes and brains. Not sure if I entirely disagree with that, but I definitely see the benefit. Anyway, scrapple is something that you slice and fry in a really hot pan until you get that to die for texture on the outside. You know that crunch that fixes you? That's what we fry things for. A Pennsylvania Dutch breakfast staple was literally just homemade or leftover scrapple, and this was one of the most popular things in not just a lot of different Amish communities, but a lot of regional communities throughout Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. Home-fermented sauerkraut was something that was essentially just Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch communities came up with. I mean, no, not sauerkraut itself. That was a German tradition through and through. Please put the guns down, guys. Homemade sauerkraut was a German and Swiss tradition, yes, but when they came over here, they obviously brought that part of their lives with them. Instead of using modern jars, Amish families would typically ferment cabbage in these stoneware crocks or large ceramic pots, and sometimes these things would cross over 20 pounds, so really, it was heavy. The cabbage that they would ferment in these, and it wasn't necessary for it to just be cabbage or sauerkraut all the time, they fermented a lot, but anyway, the cabbage was something that they would leave to ferment for around 4 to 6 weeks. At the end of it, families ate sauerkraut with pork on New Year's, and they also believed that it would help bring a lot of prosperity and good fortune to the years that were coming. I mean, hey, if that's true, I know what I should have on December 31st, 2024, because by God, the year is already looking toasty. Have you seen the heat in just February? In the heart of Amish country, dessert is more than a treat. It's a reminder of life's simpler joys. Apple dumplings, a baked delight that dates back to early settlers, capture that spirit perfectly. These individually wrapped apples were born out of a culture that prioritized resourcefulness. With apples being plentiful in Pennsylvania orchards, turning them into dumplings was a way to stretch seasonal produce into something extraordinary. The process begins with basic ingredients: peeled and cored apples, pie dough, brown sugar, cinnamon, and butter. The apples are wrapped snugly in pastry, baked in a rich cinnamon syrup, and emerge golden and aromatic. The result is a dessert that looks like it belongs on the cover of a country cookbook and tastes even better. And if you're feeling adventurous, try swapping apples for pears or experimenting with fillings like raisins or walnuts. From a practical standpoint, this dessert is frugal in every sense. Leftover dough or bruised apples, perfect for dumplings. And let's not forget, apples bring fiber, antioxidants, and a dose of vitamin C to the table. It's dessert that works harder than it has to. Paired with a scoop of vanilla ice cream, it's indulgence wrapped in tradition. So, home-canned venison wasn't just something that Amish people would use for food. For Amish families and also for a lot of rural homesteaders, home-canned venison was a very important way of preservation. It was something they relied on to store wild game meat, as a lot of them didn't have access to refrigeration, and many Amish communities didn't use electricity. Canned venison was a way for them to keep meat shelf stable, not just for an extended amount of time, but for months and years. Pressure canning was also really helpful because meat just wasn't like fruits and vegetables. You had to pressure the stuff so that it would kill all the harmful bacteria swimming around that was definitely looking to kill you. Plus, canned venison wasn't just something you didn't need refrigeration for. It was also something you didn't need a freezer for. Lots of Amish families also preferred the canned variants over the frozen ones because they believed you got a really rich flavor right out of the jar thanks to it being condensed for so long. It really took all of its time to absorb all the seasonings, you know? So throw out the Crisco and the Wesson bottles because I'm about to show you what the original cooking fat used to be. See, back in the days of your great-grandparents and the typical setting of the Red Dead series, you could pretty much expect everyone to be carrying around some beef tallow, especially if you were living in Amish households or visiting them regularly. In rural areas, whenever cattle would be slaughtered, it would be an unspoken rule to ensure that every part of the cow that was butchered would be used. This included all the internal organs, but it also meant the protective layers of fat around those organs. Also, beef tallow used to be something people USD when they didn't even have kerosene lamps and gas lighting, so they would make tallow candles from scratch and use that for light. A lot of themes wore that it really does something extra for a pie crust too, apparently. It makes them extra crispy and flaky. Not just that, Amish families also thoroughly relied on beef tallow for making soap, so they definitely knew their way around a can of this stuff. Home-fermented sauerkraut was something that was essentially just Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch communities came up with. I mean, no, not sauerkraut itself. That was a German tradition through and through. Please put the guns down, guys. Homemade sauerkraut was a German and Swiss tradition, yes, but when they came over here, they obviously brought that part of their lives with them. Instead of using modern jars, Amish families would typically ferment cabbage in these stoneware crocks or large ceramic pots, and sometimes these things would cross over 20 pounds, so really, it was heavy. The cabbage that they would ferment in these, and it wasn't necessary for it to just be cabbage or sauerkraut all the time, they fermented a lot, but anyway, the cabbage was something that they would leave to ferment for around 4 to 6 weeks. At the end of it, families ate sauerkraut with pork on New Year's, and they also believed that it would help bring a lot of prosperity and good fortune to the years that were coming. I mean, hey, if that's true, I know what I should have on December 31st, 2024, because by God, the year is already looking toasty. Have you seen the heat in just February? In Amish culture, preserving the bounty of the harvest is as much about tradition as it is about practicality. Strawberry jam, a staple in Amish households, is a perfect example of how simple ingredients can capture the essence of summer in a jar. With fresh strawberries often abundant during the growing season, turning them into jam ensured nothing went to waste while providing a sweet treat to enjoy year-round. The ingredient list is refreshingly short: ripe strawberries, sugar, and lemon juice. Unlike store-bought versions, Amish strawberry jam is typically made without preservatives, relying on careful canning techniques to keep it fresh. The process is straightforward: cooking the berries with sugar until thickened, then sealing the mixture in sterilized jars. The result is a jam that's vibrant in both color and flavor, far superior to anything you'll find on a grocery store shelf. Versatility is another strength of this jam. Spread it on homemade bread, swirl it into oatmeal, or even use it as a filling for baked goods. And from a health perspective, it offers the natural vitamins and antioxidants of strawberries without the additives found in commercial products. Economical, wholesome, and bursting with flavor, Amish strawberry jam is a testament to resourcefulness. Goose grease was something that people called poor man's butter, but before Crisco could save the day or margarine became a staple name on everyone's tongue tips, goose grease, like beef tallow, was a common sight in most Amish kitchens and rural kitchens. It was used exactly the way you would use butter or lard. You'd use it to fry, to roast, or just to spread on toast, and make it a bit more exciting and interesting than it would otherwise be. Plus, you get grease anyway. It's like when you take a car apart and you get nuts, bolts. Okay? This analogy isn't going anywhere, but you know what did go somewhere? Goose grease. It wasn't just something people used as a cheap substitute for butter, it was also something they used a traditional folk remedy. They would rub it on the chest whenever people had congestion issues, just the way people use Vicks balm today. Amish grandmothers would die on hills swearing how this works better than any of the fancy manufactured crap you can buy in stores, and maybe they really were onto something. Either way, I'll make sure to verify the next time I have some goose grease handy on me. Home-canned chicken was also a way for people to begin to basically store things without the need for refrigeration. It was really typical of most families to do this, and it was essentially the exact same deal as home-canned venison. You had to pressure can it too, and Amish families would actually have these big stovetop pressure canners to ensure that they were being safely preserved. It would be a big cause for concern and hysteria if your chicken or meat went foul, you know? Even worse if it was because of some stupid mistake that could have been easily avoided. Home-canned chicken was something that was typically packed into quart-sized mason jars, and then it was caned on butchering day. That was a special event because, see, since Amish families were so accustomed to growing their own chickens and raising them, oftentimes on butchering day they would mass process and can birds at once, and this would go up to dozens of birds by hand. I mean, I love my casseroles and chicken pot pie, but hey, that's a lot, isn't it? In Amish cooking, simplicity meets indulgence in unexpected ways, and few desserts exemplify that better than peanut butter pie. This creamy treat is rooted in practicality, using common pantry staples to create something extraordinary. Peanut butter, often seen as a humble spread, takes center stage here, offering rich flavor without the need for costly ingredients. The ingredients are minimal: creamy peanut butter, cream cheese, powdered sugar, and whipped topping, all nestled in a graham cracker crust. There's no baking involved, just mixing, chilling, and enjoying. The end result is a pie that's decadently rich but surprisingly easy to make, ideal for any occasion that calls for dessert without hours in the kitchen. Versatility is key with this pie. Dress it up with chocolate shavings, chopped nuts, or even a drizzle of caramel if you're feeling fancy. And from a cost perspective, it's a winner. No exotic ingredients required, just things you likely have on hand. For a dessert, it holds a few hidden benefits. Peanut butter is a decent source of protein and healthy fats, and the pie itself is lower in sugar than many other sweet treats. Maybe you're tired of the typical available options for glucose. Maybe you've had your fill of brown sugar, and maybe you don't really want that sugar-free diet alternative they sell in stores for everything either. A very nice Amish alternative to typical options for sugar was essentially just beet sugar. Amish and rural Midwestern families almost entirely depended on beet sugar, in fact. From locally grown sugar beets instead of imported sugarcane, they really showcased how the land could give you everything you needed if you knew how to cultivate it. It was something that became extremely popular in Amish farming communities, and sugar beet farming has a long history in tastes like Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Most descendants of those farmers live there now too, and they do still keep local refineries stocked and loaded with sugar beets. What's the difference though? Well, to be honest, there really isn't much. Beet sugar is nearly identical to cane sugar, and you could make essentially every last thing you were used to making with normal sugar with this. You could bake your cakes, do your elaborate cookie designs, pies, sweetened preserves, and jams, and have all kinds of homemade candy. If anything, You might notice a slight aftertaste that's different from your usual sugar, but it's not anything that really disturbs the vibe of the meal. In fact, most Amish families preferred these over molasses, especially for sweetening apple butter and coffee. Home-canned chicken was also a way for people to begin to basically store things without the need for refrigeration. It was really typical of most families to do this, and it was essentially the exact same deal as home-canned venison. You had to pressure can it too, and Amish families would actually have these big stovetop pressure canners to ensure that they were being safely preserved. It would be a big cause for concern and hysteria if your chicken or meat went foul, you know? Even worse if it was because of some stupid mistake that could have been easily avoided. Home-canned chicken was something that was typically packed into quart-sized mason jars, and then it was caned on butchering day. That was a special event because, see, since Amish families were so accustomed to growing their own chickens and raising them, oftentimes on butchering day they would mass process and can birds at once, and this would go up to dozens of birds by hand. I mean, I love my casseroles and chicken pot pie, but hey, that's a lot, isn't it? Corn cob jelly is a pretty pioneer recipe. It's something that originated in Amish kitchens where, again, the idea was to avoid wastage as much as you could, right? That didn't just mean the animal and living things you slaughtered to eat. It also meant that after you took out the kernels from the sweet corn, you wouldn't leave the cobs alone. No, those were boiled so that the natural sugar and flavors that were in them could be extracted. And that would pretty much make this really exquisite honey-like jelly. And the color of this would switch up too. So if you were using your typical yellow corn cob, then you would get this really overly golden and honey-looking jelly. But if you used red corn cobs, then you would get a red or pink-hued jelly that was really similar to strawberry jam. Funnily enough, despite being made from corn cobs, a lot of people often said that it just felt like it tasted like honey or apple jelly. This did mean that it was an incredible, free, and natural alternative to honey when it would be too expensive or when budgets were tight. Hey, it's still something you can find in local Amish markets and roadside farm stands, so it's not completely forgotten, but it's not even 25% as widespread as it used to be. Amish cooking is deeply rooted in preservation, both of traditions and of ingredients. Pickled cabbage is a prime example, a tangy, sweet dish that reflects the Amish ingenuity for extending the life of fresh produce. Historically, pickling was an essential skill for families to ensure vegetables lasted through the long winter months. This particular recipe, with its balance of sweet and sour flavors, became a staple on the Amish table, served alongside hearty meals or at community gatherings. The ingredients are as straightforward as they come: shredded cabbage, vinegar, sugar, water, and a touch of salt. Some variations include celery seed or mustard seed for added flavor. The process is simple but effective, with the cabbage soaking up the pickling brine to achieve its characteristic crunch and tang. Practicality is one of its biggest selling points. It's an excellent way to use up extra cabbage from the garden, and the finished dish keeps for weeks in the refrigerator. Its versatility is equally impressive. Serve it as a side dish, add it to sandwiches, or use it to brighten up a plate of meat and potatoes. From a health perspective, pickled cabbage offers fiber, probiotics if naturally fermented, and a dose of vitamin C and K. Pickled red beets are something that are a must-have side dish for most Amish families and their dinner time, and it's always something you see being served with American classics like roast chicken, pot roast, or some ham. Beets were always grown in most gardens that Amish families had, since relying on agricultural practices to help sustain supplies was a common thing for them. Amish versions of these pickled beets tend to be a lot sweeter than the grocery store Overzion, which I'm not really sure why, except of course that delectable brine they make. Throw some vinegar, sugar, cinnamon, cloves, and allspice in, and you have yourself an incredible kind of broth and brine. Eggs would typically be pickled in the brine along with it, and one of the most popular things to do was to basically just take these hard-boiled eggs where the beet brine that's left over is used for soaking them. Then they get this really aesthetic pink color and a taste you can't miss anywhere, so now your food can be just as pretty as you. Sorghum syrup was, and I really need to stress this, not the same thing as molasses. I mean, sure, maybe people threw in some molasses there, typically blackstrap ones, but sorghum syrup was something that just came from sorghum cane and not sugar cane. It had a much fruitier and lighter texture, and it was also sour, had molasses, and had a lot of benefits to your skin just like dandelions do. But see, making sorghum syrup really wasn't easy. In fact, a lot of people regarded it as this massive community effort. In Amish farm communities or southern communities, it was a big practice for families to get together, make an entire day out of it, and begin harvesting the tall sorghum stalks. They would run those bad boys through a horse or a mule-powered press just to get some of that good juice out, and that juice was then boiled down for literally hours. Imagine the scent. It was boiled just so it would thicken into a really rich syrup, and by now you might have noticed that a lot of Amish recipes rely on boiling and reducing things to syrups and jellies, and I think I'm really vibing with that. I mean, everyone can make a meatloaf, but how many people do you know that can whip up 5 different types of syrups and jellies on a whim? For the Amish, preserving the harvest is both a necessity and an art, and apple butter is a delicious result of that tradition. This sweet, spiced spread originated as a way to use up an abundance of apples, often collected during the peak of the harvest season. Unlike traditional butter, it contains no dairy, just apples cooked low and slow until they caramelize into a rich, smooth spread. The ingredients are deceptively simple: apples, cider or water, sugar, and spices like cinnamon and cloves. The apples are simmered for hours, allowing their natural sugars to intensify while the mixture thickens to perfection. The slow cooking process is where the magic happens, transforming humble fruit into a velvety spread that's bursting with autumnal flavor. Apple butter is as practical as it is versatile. Spread it on warm Amish white bread, swirl it into oatmeal, or use it as a secret ingredient in baked goods for extra moisture and depth of flavor. Apple butter can even double as a healthier sweetener in recipes because it retains the fiber, vitamins, and antioxidants of its core ingredient while avoiding the preservatives of store-bought options. Dried dandelion greens were one of the most readily available sources of vitamins in Amish communities, especially rural ones. People wouldn't really rely on buying store-bought greens. Instead, Amish families had long-held cultural practices surrounding foraging. They would forage for dandelions mostly in spring and summer, and I don't know about you, but that's some real cottagecore stuff to me. Why don't my friends ever message me for a Wednesday 9 a.m. berry and dandelion picking plan? If you're the friend in the group considering this, at least shoot a text so I can live vicariously through you. Oh, but it'll be worth your while too. Dandelion greens aren't just good to the taste, but they feel a lot like spinach too. They're also extremely good for your skin, mixed with other wild greens that make an incredible salad. They work as a detox if you can mix them into a tonic, and Amish communities would essentially ground them into this coffee-like beverage that would help a lot with stomach issues. Corn cob jelly is a pretty pioneer recipe. It's something that originated in Amish kitchens where, again, the idea was to avoid wastage as much as you could, right? That didn't just mean the animal and living things you slaughtered to eat. It also meant that after you took out the kernels from the sweet corn, you wouldn't leave the cobs alone. No, those were boiled so that the natural sugar and flavors that were in them could be extracted. And that would pretty much make this really exquisite honey-like jelly. And the color of this would switch up too. So if you were using your typical yellow corn cob, then you would get this really overly golden and honey-looking jelly. But if you used red corn cobs, then you would get a red or pink-hued jelly that was really similar to strawberry jam. Funnily enough, despite being made from corn cobs, a lot of people often said that it just felt like it tasted like honey or apple jelly. This did mean that it was an incredible, free, and natural alternative to honey when it would be too expensive or when budgets were tight. Hey, it's still something you can find in local Amish markets and roadside farm stands, so it's not completely forgotten, but it's not even 25% as widespread as it used to be. In Amish homes, chicken and noodles was original comfort food, blending simple ingredients with a legacy of practicality. Historically, this meal was a way to make the most of farm staples. When a chicken was butchered, no part went to waste, and homemade egg noodles stretched the dish to serve a crowd. The recipe revolves around basic ingredients: shredded chicken, homemade egg noodles, chicken broth, and a touch of cream or butter for richness. The egg noodles are the star of the show, made with just flour and eggs, hand-rolled and cut with care. Once combined with a savory broth, they create a thick, hearty dish that's almost stew-like in texture. Versatility is where this recipe shines. Add carrots, celery, or peas for extra nutrition, or swap the chicken for turkey after a holiday meal. Leftovers are easily reheated, making it as practical as it is delicious. Health-wise, this dish is well-balanced. Lean protein from the chicken, carbohydrates from the noodles, and an option to sneak in vegetables. Economical, satisfying, and steeped in tradition, Amish chicken and noodles is a reminder that simple food can be simply extraordinary. If one recipe brought back a memory, share it below, like the video, and subscribe for more lost flavors worth remembering.